Okay, can everybody hear? All right, got a good PA here. All right, for those of you that don't know, our extension plant pathologist, she's amazing, Dr. Alyssa Koehler, and I'm going to let her introduce her team, and we have another great faculty member with our Department of Plant Soil Science here.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining our tour stalk here. So as mentioned, I'm the extension plant pathologist, and I'll do kind of just some quick point outs to my crew. Technician, Chris Holden's over there, and we've got some grad students over here. Matt Henderson's a PhD student. Lauren just joined us as a master's student, and Erin and Yuki are some undergrads that are working with us this summer. And Isabel, you'll hear from later, is a postdoc in my group. So we work across diseases in corn, small grains, soybeans, cucurbits, lima beans, pretty much anything that we're growing here. But today's talk will be focused mostly on corn. So I will take just a minute or two to kind of do a recap on kind of disease pressure. We've kind of been one of those summers where we had some dry patches, but then it's been wet the past few weeks, which can get some of that foliar disease ramped up. The new disease that's kind of on everyone's mind is tar spot, and so far we are still in the clear. We've not found any tar spot yet in Delaware, and so far I had just checked in with a few folks in Maryland kind of network that have been checking in Maryland, and they haven't seen any yet this year. There were a couple of those positive confirmations in Maryland counties last year, but none showing up for this year. So that's great news. We're hopefully far enough now into the corn crop that we're going to be in the clear for, even if it does show up by the time we get to R5, R6, we shouldn't have any yield damage that's going to be coming for this year. But that's something we'll continue to scout for and keep an eye on. And that one, again, gets its name tar spot because it looks like little flecks of tar that are on there. So if you have any plants that you think are suspicious, you see a black spot on it that's raised and you're scratching it with your fingernail and it's not coming off, send us a lead, give us a phone call, we'll come out and take a look with you. That is one we're keeping an eye on. Behind me today, I'll kind of segue and transition. So we've got some demo here of short corn versus tall corn. And we have a few newly funded projects for the lab, a couple that are focused on Pythium. But we also have this project that is looking at some cover crop interactions with short and tall corn. And I will pass the mic over to Dr. Isabel Emanuel to introduce some of what we're doing in this project.
Thanks, Alyssa. Hi, everybody. So, as Alyssa mentioned, I am in the plant pathology lab, and I'm working with our project on short and tall stature corn. So, across the street, we actually have this trial going with the two varieties behind me. So, on my right, we have the short stature corn. This is going to reach about up to 7 feet, and compared to the tall stature corn on the left, this is going to be about 9 to 11 feet. And the difference when it's right next to each other is pretty obvious. And so we have our trial going with 3 different cover cropping treatments. They're rye cover cropping treatments where we terminate 2 weeks before planting, 2 weeks after planting, and then we have the no cover cropping treatment. And pretty much what we're trying to look at is how the variety of the corn versus the cover cropping treatment kind of affects the crop's physiology. So we're looking at seedling emergence, we're looking at initial shoot height and then mature shoot height. We're also looking at some stalk integrity parameters. So one of the main benefits of the short stature corn that we're trying to figure out is whether we have a decreased lodging risk with this decreased height, which is really important in the mid-Atlantic region because we do get those really strong storms, especially in the late summer like we saw in northern Delaware and Maryland a few days ago. So we're looking for, again, increased stalk integrity. Another benefit or potential benefit of the short stature corn is that it allows us to apply pesticides with some equipment that we are really inhibited by the type of the mature tall corn. And then we're also trying to see if we have like a decreased fodder, so less plant material going through the combines during harvest. So a bunch of different potential benefits. So with our research study, I'm on the plant pathology side. So we do have a few concerns actually with short corn that we want to investigate. So you might not be able to see from the truck, but if I go over here, we can see with our short stature corn, the ear is actually going to be a lot closer to the ground than with this tall stature corn over here, maybe like 1 or 2 feet. And so from a plant pathology perspective, why this is so important is a lot of our foliar diseases that we're going to be looking at today kind of splash up from plant material left on the ground. And so when that ear gets closer to the ground, what we're concerned about is that we get increased disease pressure, and we might see some yield loss from that. So this is our first year of doing this trial, and so we don't have any data yet, but hopefully in a few months we'll be able to see if this is an important factor. So if I could get some of the other plant pathologists over there to come show you some samples of what typical diseases we look at with the corn. We have some that can go on the buses. So we have some handouts here with some examples of the diseases. We have corn smut, which is the first disease that I'll go through. So one of those handouts talks about corn smut. This is a type of rust, and it's pretty much an ear disease. And what you'll see is that the fungus takes over that corn kernel, and these silvery, kind of black, grainy tumors will grow instead of the corn kernel. This really, some cultures really like to use this to make a type of South American cuisine called wheat lacoche. But for around here, I guess it's kind of just like an inconvenience. So that's one of the diseases that we have today. The only ear disease actually that we have out here today. And we actually have a lot of it in our field over here this year for some reason, so it's kind of cool to look at. Some other additional samples, we have a lot of like foliar spot leaf diseases. So on some of those handouts, the major disease is gray leaf spot. So we're handing out some leaves here. Gray leaf spot, the symptoms typically include long rectangular lesions that are a little bit gray in color. Again, these move up the canopy throughout the year, and they can get as high as like about 70% on the leaf. One of the main concerns is that when we get a lot of gray leaf spot, the plant kind of tries to send nutrients up to attack that, and we can also get a little bit of increased lodging, which is not ideal. Some other of the pathogens that were not typically very heavy in this area, we have some handouts for. That includes curvularia, smaller lesions, typically with a red or yellow border, and they're more circular. We also have some diplodia leaf streak, which is going to look a little bit rounded and larger lesions, and they're also going to have little black pycnidial spores in there. So I am going to next give you over to Jared here? Yeah. So I'll let you look at those handouts while we do this little transition. Next, I'm going to give you to Dr. Jared Miller to talk about the cover cropping treatments.
All right. So another part of this study that we're looking at is the effect that shading might have on growth of grain crops. And so it fits really well, since we have the short corn in the study, to kind of mix it up with a cover crop study that we wanted to look at. So one of the ways that we try to suppress weeds, right, is get canopy coverage to shade out and prevent weed growth. And what plants do, there's two type of mechanisms that plants do with shade. One is they just adapt to it. So if you walk through a forest and you see plants growing well, they adapt to the shade of the trees and they grow well. Most of our grain crops, they're bred to compete. They've been selected out to compete with shading. So they try to get above it. And they don't know what's actually there. What they're actually measuring is this thing called the red-far red ratio. So plants are absorbing red light reflecting green. If there's a weed next to a corn plant, next to a soybean plant, it's going to read that ratio of light, and then it's going to try to outgrow it. And what we actually notice the same thing with cover crops is that they see it the same way. They don't actually know what's there. So here, not very clear from back there, but you can see some thicker corn here on the end. We put this in the weekly crop update, but when our planter put a few too many seeds on the end here, the corn started competing with itself. It didn't know what was there. It just started trying to outgrow it. If you've ever late planted, if you've ever terminated a cover crop later, or you've had rye, you might have noticed that the corn in those fields looks a little taller. You might think it's actually doing better. But when you look at some of the corn plants in a field without a cover crop, with a cover crop, the stem gets longer and the leaves get a little spindly. It doesn't look as strong. So our question was, if we're going to late terminate a cover crop, and it starts to see that as competition, even though it's not, is it going to put more effort in the stem, maybe less in the roots, and is is it going to cause issues later in the season with stalk strength? So what we have noticed so far, and it's interesting even with the short corn, is, and we've seen it in studies before, pretty much here on the end, this yellow is all the late terminated rye. Having no cover or burning down 2 weeks ahead of time, the corn was pretty much the same height. But through the early season, right up to about when we hit VT, the tasseling stage, all of the corn, either whether short or tall, was higher in any plot with a cover crop. Now we've seen studies where late termination reduced yield, so even though we've seen increased height, it doesn't mean it's better. It also doesn't mean it's worse. That's what we'll find out when we actually get the yields out of these plots. And we've also flown over them with the drone that we have. So you can see the growth across here. We've got planting early on. We have rapid growth. And then right here where you kind of max out, you get maximum canopy coverage right about when you hit the VT stage. When you get about this and it covers the ground, you can't see soil. It maxed it out with the measurements it can read. But what was interesting with the drone that we noticed is even though the short corn is shorter now, through the drone measurements, early in the season, right about V6 to V8, the short corn actually had greater greenness than the tall corn. So it looks like the short corn itself might have its own competition mode where early on it tries to get above. So the traditional corn, it knows it's going to get taller. So it competes early and maybe goes slower, but it looks like the short corn might actually have an extra competitive edge early on because it knows it needs to get above those weeds. So this is just the first year of the study. We'll repeat it 2 more years and hopefully see the effects. Even though it's trying to outgrow the cover crop, it might not make a difference, but it's still an effect that we need to look at if we're going to tell people to terminate later to understand how these crops might respond to that kind of shade.
Thank you. So I am probably new to most of you. My name is Erin Sparks, and I am a research faculty up in Newark. And my lab is interested in lodging and preventing lodging. And so in order to do that, we don't want to wait for a storm to come, right? And then have you all suffering because your field's down, and then we can try to back calculate why that plant lodged. And so instead we build tools that measure the strength of both stalks and roots. So to my left is John Reneau. He is a research scientist in my lab. And so he's going to give you a quick demo of one of these devices. So actually, first, would you show this for?
All right.
So the small device that John is going to hold up now is a device that we built to measure how strong the root is anchored in the soil. So if you think about the root system as a spring, we're basically measuring the stiffness of this spring. So it gets attached to the base of the plant. We click some buttons, it runs, it's non-destructive, and it basically will test how stiff that root system is in the soil. What's interesting is that the stiffer your root system is, the more prone to lodging, right? If you think about how we engineer buildings for earthquakes, a really stiff base is going to fail. And so the same principles are now applying to plants, where there has to be enough movement to absorb those forces and not cause root lodging. On the other end of that, we have this device in front of us, which we have creatively called the pusher. We're still trying to come up with a better name for it. But this device, so all of what we work in is in biomechanics. So basically the principle is you're applying a displacement and you're measuring forces. How we apply those displacements tells us different things about the plant. So in this case, go please. So you can see very slowly this lead screw is moving forward. There's a load cell that is just constantly reading forces, and then it retracts. And if it's not too windy, we'll get some nice clean data that maybe you'll be able to see on the screen here. But basically you see this nice slope up. The steeper that slope, the stiffer the plant is, right? So the more force it took to displace those plants the same amount. So we are using this in the context of the short corn and the tall corn to understand if standability can be measured without waiting for a lodging event here in the Mid-Atlantic. So with that, I have no idea about time.
Questions?
Questions?
Any questions? Okay.
say the great thing about this is when we get done, we're going to be up in the Grove, so you'll get an opportunity to interact directly with our outstanding speakers. But let's give everybody a big round of applause. The neat thing about this too is I've been here a long time, long time, 37 years, believe it or not. And the great thing about this, we've got some amazing young faculty now that have joined our Department of Plant Soil Sciences and Applied Economics and Statistics, and it's really invigorating to see the expertise and the talent that's ahead of us. It's going to be leading all of us into making agriculture better moving forward. So again, it's a pleasure and a privilege to work with such an amazing group of people. Okay, we're going to load up. Y'all hang on to your seats. We're going across the field because our routes have been modified a little bit due to Mother Nature.